Welcome, I'm Tania Johnson, registered psychologist, registered play therapist, co-founder of the Institute of Child Psychology. Today, we're going to be chatting about school avoidance. Now, for many parents, at some point, their kiddo is going to have a hard time going to school. When it's fleeting, it tends to be pretty manageable, and most parents don't need interventions. However, for some kiddos, it becomes far more chronic. For instance, in Canada, it's estimated that about a quarter of students at some point will struggle with school avoidance. For some kids, it's just them saying again and again and again that they don't want to go to school, while for other kids, it goes to them actually missing days, weeks, and in some cases, years. The reasons for school avoidance are varied. It often comes down to things like pre-existing mental health conditions, anxiety, depression. Children who are neurodiverse often have a harder time at school. Bullying, a big one now, is cyberbullying. Children who are highly sensitive and who really struggle with the amount of stimulation in school environments. And for some children, it comes down to familial issues. So when there is high pressures from families when it comes to performance, when there are pre-existing mental health issues within the family, or when there's low participation from a family in a child's school experience. All of those factors combine together to put a child at a higher risk. Very often I like to think of it almost as what's happening with the child, then what's happening with the school, what's happening with the wider community, and how are all of those different places and spaces for a child interconnecting and communicating. One of the biggest issues that we see for children who miss school is this belief of I cannot. So the more school they miss, the deeper they get into this belief of, I cannot go to school. Kids will laugh at me. Now I've missed too much. Now I'm never going to be able to catch up. So why go? It really becomes the self-fulfilling prophecy. And the longer they stay away from experiences that push them into being uncomfortable, the more they believe I am not able to be in vulnerable spaces. I am not able to be in uncomfortable spaces. So again, it becomes the self-fulfilling prophecy for many of our kiddos, which is why one of the biggest things that we want to remember with our children when they're struggling with school avoidance is that the earlier we intervene, the better. When children stay home for days, weeks, months, years, it becomes almost impossible to get them back to where they can be. So that's our first tip for today is, number one, we want to make sure that if our child is struggling, that we intervene as quickly as possible. 2, that we communicate with the school. We find that person, talk to the school counselor, talk to the teacher, talk to administration, and we start figuring out what does this child need. Obviously, every kiddo is going to be different, but what does this child need to succeed? As the adults in a child's world, we want to put on our thinking caps and become detectives. So instead of focusing on the behavior, they won't come to school. How do we get them to school? One of the most traumatic things that we can do is drag a child into a school. We have to become more curious and go, okay, where is this anxiety coming from? Where is this feeling of low self-efficacy coming from for this child? What's happening in their relationships with a teacher, with other students? How do we help this child to develop a meaningful relationship with being at school? How do we increase their sense of competency at school? Those conversations are incredibly important. So the family and the school have to get on the same page. That's first. Early intervention, family and school together are critical. Let's look at family and then let's look at school. With the family, we want to see why this child's cup is so full. What's happening, that there's spillage, that their little nervous systems are not settling themselves. We really want to focus on helping the family to figure out how do we create consistency, calm, rhythm within the house. Some of the biggest factors that have been shown to help families deal with stress is being able to control what actually happens in their day. Dr. Bruce Perry did beautiful studies that show when there is daily structure, when families sit down together for family meals, when there's limited screens, when families move their bodies, when they're connected to their community, when they reach out for help when help is needed, when they prioritize sleep as a family, and when the family focuses on positive, future-focused mindsets, that those families tend to thrive even if there is stress in the household, because then our life becomes more predictable and we have a greater sense of control. When families are struggling and there's no sense of rhythm, there's no sense of connection, it's very hard for our children to soothe their nervous system. So if we are struggling, we want to make sure that we engage in family counseling. And as I mentioned, one of those risk factors is family mental health. So sometimes we need to take our focus away from just the student and look at what's happening with mom, with dad, a brother or sister, and make sure that the family is getting the help that they need. One of the other reasons that children engage in school avoidance is if they feel as if they need to look after a parent. Okay, so we want to try and figure out what's happening with the family, where we can help, what resources are needed. If a child is asking to stay at home, we also want to be very careful that home isn't providing entertainment that school doesn't. So, for example, things like being able to stay on your computer game all day, not getting out of bed, doing really fun things with mom and dad. All of those things are competing variables with getting a child to school. Okay, getting a child back to school. The number one thing that a child needs is a sense of safety. So how do we help this child to feel more safe at school? We can start with physical safety and then let's talk about emotional safety. So for instance, if we look at the classroom, what's happening? Is there a ton of stimulation? Fluorescent lights, terrible for mental health. What's happening with the posters? What's happening with the amount of noise in the classroom? What's happening with ventilation in the classroom? What's happening with temperature, with heat in the classroom? All of these variables directly impact mental health. And what can we do to shift it? So even if it's as simple as we need to have those lights off more often, we need to open the windows if we can open the windows. Let's take some of those posters off the wall. And if we cannot change the classroom environment, how do we help the child to get out of that classroom environment when needed? Can they go for a walk? Are there quiet spaces within the school? Can they go to the counselor's office? Physical environment is huge and we don't talk about it enough. We want to remember that coming into school, being at school is obviously very stressful for the student. So throwing them right into a really busy classroom full of lots of kiddos isn't always the best thing for our children. Can we, as they arrive at school, can we create some sort of gap which helps to calm their nervous system, helps to recalibrate them? Can they help with gardening outside? Can they perhaps go to the kindergarten class and be a helper there? Can they start off in the principal's office? What do we need to soothe this child's system so that they can reintegrate into the classroom? And I find often having those buffers can be really, really impactful. The next is emotional safety. When a child is struggling, they need somebody to anchor them at school, whether that's a teacher, whether that is somebody who's in a supportive role, whether that is another peer. And it can be helpful if that person comes out and actually meets mom, dad, the student at the gate as they arrive at school, so that they can be that transitional person for that child. We have that safety bit, we have that connection, but that has to come first. And again, the adults are all working in the background here to figure out what's going on. So we have safety, we have relationship. The next part of this is skill building, which has to come after safety and relationship. So within that skill building, we want to move slowly. We don't want to just throw a child into a classroom with a whole lot of threats or punishments or reward systems that I often see fail because we haven't actually dealt with what's going on underneath. In this competency bit, we're figuring out what skills does this child need? How do we start to slowly build those skills? What are they struggling with? So for example, if they are anxious, if they are depressed, if they are struggling with low self-efficacy, those are the components that we're working on. And then we move slowly. So gradual re-entry into school. We might want them to just come to the principal's office for a little bit, and then maybe they move to the counselor's office. Then maybe they sit with a trusted adult in their classroom for half the morning, and then we make it the full morning. We don't necessarily need to go back into a full school day, but we do know the sooner we reintegrate our children into school, the better the long-term outcomes. So we want to move slowly. The next thing that children often struggle with school avoidance, as mentioned earlier, is low self-efficacy. So our role as the adults in this child's world is to figure out what is going to give this child a sense of purpose at school. What is their gift? Where does their competencies lie? And then how do we nurture that to give them a reason to come to school every single day? Find it, use it. It's a huge part of this. School avoidance. We so often think of it as a behavior we have to fix. but it's really important that we look at the wider environment, get everybody involved, and that we prioritize things that fill a child's wellness bucket, like play, movement, touch, human connection, rest, time in nature. When we build up a child's resources, we're less likely to see the spillage of an overactive nervous system. Thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who are interested, we do have a full-length course on childhood anxiety. I'll link it in the description below.